Chapter 29, Lord Latimer's Ladies, by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, read by Dan McLaughlin. Chapter 29, The Mrs. Downs Affair. Brian's sense of serenity was short-lived. He felt an onslaught of intense thirst that nearly overwhelmed him. He still had the glass in hand, but rather than letting Iris fill it for him, he rose unsteadily to his feet and staggered to the table where the water pitcher stood, half empty. It was tempting to drink straight from the pitcher, but Brian suspected that would be more theatrical than effective. He filled his glass, drank it in quick gulps, filled it again, and drained it. Each swallow slid down his throat with a tangible sense of relief, one that couldn't last, with his body sending him urgent signals that it wanted more and more. Absent insulin, he knew his body was trying to flush his blood sugar through his kidneys. Brian, sweetie, Alice stood at his elbow, though he'd been too intent on filling his glass a third time to have noticed her approach. "What is your blood sugar?" "About 300, it feels like," he said. The only reason he wasn't trying to speak and drink at the same time was because he didn't want to waste any more of the water by spilling it. He guzzled another glass and almost mechanically moved to refill it. "Don't you think you should check it?" Alice asked. Brian, however, was past caring. "Doesn't matter. I can't do anything about it. Hardly any insulin left anyway." His hands were shaking and unsteady, and he could feel himself sweating. From the looks of Iris and the other ladies were giving him, he suspected he was pale and pasty, but that was just another thing he had no control over. He drank the last glass and set it down carefully. Restless and hating he felt so weak and sick, Brian began to pace. He turned and lurched toward the piano, drawn to a pile of sheet music stacked untidily at its side. He began to go through the stack, one piece at a time, setting them in order with an intense, set expression that drew the attention of the others in the room. They watched as he set a Bach concerto next to something by Handel. "This goes next to this," he said. Good. What are you doing? Brian asked Alice. Organizing stuff. As Brian's brain was slowly dying from a lack of fuel, it was processing poorly, and clearly he had found a task that matched his level of consciousness. But why Bach next to Handel? Asked Eliza, as if this were another game from the future. The notes go down, don't you see? Brian answered, pointing to the music. Go down? Asked a confused Eliza. Brian doesn't read music, said Eliza, frowning in concern. Oh dear, said Iris. Everyone turned to her, hoping for an explanation. When my uncle entered his final decline, it was much the same, but for him it was snuff boxes. He had to set them in order and refused to let the housemaids touch them. It became an obsession with him. We were never able to understand that madness of his last hours, or even if there ever was any method to his madness. Oh, this one has a lot of notes, Brian said in tones of approval. He placed that piece of music in a new pile of its own. Well then, I'd better go ask Mrs. Downs to join us, Alice said. It's high time to ask her about the riddles she wrote. What? Iris asked, momentarily distracted from Brian's odd behavior. Alice, dear, what are you thinking? Go and ask her to join us? You're the lady of the house, lectured Lenora, and she's the housekeeper, said Eliza, displaying a unity of opinion. She comes to you, dear, she added a bit more kindly. I don't know, Alice said. I feel like it would be rude to just summon her as if I were lord of the manor or something. Technically, I am the lord of the manor, said Brian, without looking up from his self-appointed task. Oh, Alice, you and your colonial sensibility, sighed Iris. She waved her hand in the direction of the servants. Send for this Mrs. Downs at once, she said, and the flunky nearest the door departed post haste. Alice sputtered. I'd hoped to ease into things, maybe try to butter her up before the interrogation. Vintage Alice, Brian said, as he put a field nocturne next to a Paganini violin piece. See, they both have 3 dots right here, he explained, to anyone who might be paying attention. That means they both go here, I think. And he put a Pangini next to a libretto from an aria called La Muerte de Portici in yet another pile. These ones got both a lot of tic-tac-toe thingies. What do you mean? Asked Eliza, still trying to solve the game of Brian's ordering principle. He pointed to the key signatures on the pages, but aloud he tugged at another thread in the conversation. See? If Alice is Alice, then I'm really screwed. Brian looked up from his work, breathing heavily and reaching up to the stifling cravat around his throat. He struggled with it, untied it, and pulled it away from his neck with obvious relief. Even that didn't seem to be enough, and he turned to the water pitcher, poured some water on his cravat, and used it to cool his brow. The way Alice tries to convince someone to do something takes time. She's nice, you see, and wears you down with that niceness until you do what she wants. But I'm not sure if I have time for that to work. Cravat at his aching head, Brian scooped up the still unsorted music and carried it along as he sprawled in a chair. Wait a minute, began Alice. Brian ignored her and looked over the sheet music. What about this? Brian held a work by Sophie Lebrun in his one hand, slapped it on the nearest table, then immediately covered it up with something else, in this case, something by Anthony Heinrich. Same typeface, Brian explained, and with hardly a pause went back to explaining the mysteries of Alice. Alice thinks that if she is nice first, then the other person will be nice back. If the other person doesn't respond in kind, my sister imagines that she must not have been nice enough. That's the trap. Brian, Alice said, I don't think. It's his condition, murmured Iris. My uncle exhibited the same behavior just before. She second guesses herself, Brian continued, and third guesses herself, content with being put off because she never stops to think that just because maybe the person she's dealing with might not actually be even a little bit nice. And so we wait. The ladies were fascinated, and Alice shocked. "How long has this been in your head, Bry?" she asked. He didn't bother to answer, instead slipping the music she and the ladies had written into another pile. "Alice's stuff," he muttered, visibly shifting his mental energy to continue. "God, I feel like crap. Hummel next to Burger, I think," he said, struggling to his feet in order to set these two works, for reasons of his own, on a table near a decorative lamp. By now, the scores were scattered in random piles on various surfaces around the room. The ladies were struggling to follow his point, a task not made easier as his diabetic brain bounced back and forth between the equally vital topics of Alice's relationships and which pieces of music really belonged together. "Publisher's mark is a unicorn," he said in a tone of satisfaction. "Rhodey next to Spumoni. Like this. So, La Versatile." Brian continued to randomly sort the music. "Kind of rhymes," he said, distracted by this train of thought. "If you say it right, Alice," said Iris. The two ladies exchanged worried glances. "Right, Alice," said Brian, who was getting near the end of the stack. "Now the system works fine, so long as you've got the time to do the dance and everyone knows the rules. But if the other person is just an asshole, it takes her forever to call him on it. And Alice isn't your run-of-the-mill good person. She's resilient, which means she can keep surviving on the smallest crumbs of affection for years because she believes in people. She believes truly in her heart of hearts that if she can just find the right key, she'll unlock the nice guy who must exist down deep under that crap he puts her through." Clearly, the comments had a context the ladies were not privy to. "That's enough," said Alice. "Can we not talk about my divorce anymore? I mean, she's not stupid," Brian said. "Just fatally kind. But confrontation is not something she's going to do overnight. Handel next to Beethoven. Dum-de-dum-dum. The big guns. He finally looked up and met Alice's seething gaze. I'm just saying, it seems to me if I'm going to rely on you to work through our issues with Mrs. D using your traditional methods, I'm sunk. Alice's eyes filled with tears. I had no idea you felt that way. You never said anything before. Done sorting and speaking in the same moment, Brian's burst of manic energy left at once. He sank weakly into the nearest seat and reached for his empty water glass. Thirsty, indeed, said Iris. Clearly, something we must talk about later, agreed Lenora hastily as the door opened. The housekeeper arrived, trailed by the hapless servant who had been sent to fetch her and who had at least had the forethought to bring a fresh pitcher of water. You summoned me, my lady? It was hard to tell if Mrs. Downs was annoyed or merely trying to catch her breath. Clearly, the servant had made clear that her presence was required with the utmost haste. Alice began. Thank you, Mrs. Downs. Normally, of course, I wouldn't interrupt you in your work. A flutter of fans and a discreet cough from Eliza made Alice pause. As Mrs. Downs took in the united front of the ladies and Brian's pallor, Alice regrouped and started again. We know, my brother and I, that you're like us. I beg your pardon? Asked Mrs. Downs frostily. I mean that you're a time traveler, said Alice, trapped here from another time. Like we are, and like Mr. Shield and Miss Pocket, you are not alone, and we think if we work together, we might all be able to get home again. Mrs. Downs remained silent, but Alice steeled herself and went on. So, we need you to tell us why you wrote those riddles she concluded. A trifle wordy, but acceptable, murmured Iris, as the other ladies nodded approvingly. What makes you think I had anything to do with? Mrs. Downs began, puffing herself up indignantly, but Alice held up a hand to stop her. I spoke with Master Sharp in the village, she said, and he showed me the letters you had written to him. I recognize the handwriting from the note you left for my brother. I am trying to understand why you wrote it and the others. The housekeeper lifted her chin. I don't regret what I did, she said. You have no idea what it's been like all these years. The Dowager and old Sharp, they just thought of making everyone comfortable, but I had the house to run. The house? Echoed Alice, surprised. The house is in my charge. I must see it clean and running well. It was one thing to hire villagers to cook and clean, but what was I to do when Mr. Shield came? He was very intelligent, very capable, and we needed an upstairs manservant. Before I gave him the riddle, he was despondent, no motivation. But once he had a goal, Mrs. Downs gave a brisk nod. Well, he went straight to work. I convinced him that he could look for the answer to the riddle all he liked on his own time, and it worked. It worked for a while, said Alice, shaking her head, but he never found the book, and he started looking for other ways to get home. He could have burned the house down with his Leyden jars. He didn't need to do that, said Mrs. Downs, as if it were the valet's fault and his alone. I never asked him to do that. No, only to look for a book you knew he wouldn't find, snapped Alice. And why that book? Asked Brian, out of morbid curiosity. Natural theology? The Dowager used to keep a copy of it at her bedside, said Mrs. Downs, and I was sitting with her in her room when the storm came. I knew it was no ordinary storm, and there would be a new arrival, but not who it would be. When lightning struck, that book, the Dowager's book, almost flew off the shelf. It landed right at my feet, and I took it for a sign. I knew what I had to do, and I wrote the riddle right away. It wasn't very well written and rather crude, said Lenora, clearly disapproving of the housekeeper and her methods. Here, Mrs. Downs colored slightly as she mentally reviewed the poem. I did my best, but I never claimed to be a poet, she said, but I thought it would be more believable if it rhymed. I kept the book with me, she added. I didn't want to run any risks. When it seemed like enough time had passed, I took the book and had it burned. Eliza gasped at such audacity and clutched her own copy of the book more tightly. Carl, the castle, slammed a door and rattled his windows, equally outraged. So, Alice persisted, frowning. So when new people appeared in the castle, you assigned them a riddle you knew they couldn't solve. Mrs. Downs said, it gave them hope to be looking. I didn't want to be cruel. They didn't need to know, as I did, that it was hopeless and we'd never get home. Whatever you thought on the matter, your actions were cruel, said Iris. Because of this madness, Lord Latimer is ill and may die. I had no way of knowing he was sickly when he arrived, said Mrs. Downs. I only take them as they come. With the dowager gone, the castle needed a lord or a lady. I thought it was good fortune for him so young, and with, as I thought, his lady wife by his side, she added, with a grudging nod to Alice. His wife? She asked, incredulous. You had nothing on your person to suggest you were his sister, protested Mrs. Downs. I'd been writing to the young ladies, wishful of having the dowager adopt one of them as heir. Wishful of having the dowager adopt one of them as her heir, but she passed away before that could be done. Then the two of you came, and it seemed so much better, I thought, if the young lord and lady could have heirs of their own and keep the castle for generations. Alice was speechless for the moment at the audacity of it all, then shook her head, throwing her hands in the air. I'm sick of talking to you, she said. Carl, have you been listening to this nonsense? Politely, but firmly, the door to the music room creaked ajar and closed again. Mrs. Downs went white as a sheet and looked ready to faint. Brian could almost sympathize. His head aching, he was just relieved that the castle hadn't taken to slamming things again. Do we really need to find all the objects from these riddles in order for you to take everyone home again? Asked Alice. The door opened and closed again. All signs point to yes, said Brian, his mind clearly on a different track as he mentally shook and read a magic 8-ball. Excellent, said Alice. She turned back to Mrs. Downs. We have found a copy of the book, so that's done. Tell us what the other riddle said needed to be found. We'll find it and we'll be able to go home and get Brian his insulin. No, said Mrs. Downs. What? Alice blinked. No, my lady, said Mrs. Downs. I won't tell you that. I don't want to be whisked away again. I am very sorry for Lord Latimer, but I prefer to stay right where I am. Brian felt his knees give way and he sank down to the sofa, shaking his head. This is monstrous, whispered Iris after a long, horrified moment. It doesn't matter, said Alice in a sudden, brisk turn. We don't need you. We know who has the other riddle. You may go, Mrs. Downs, as the housekeeper curtsied and turned to leave. Alice added, No, I mean you are fired, Mrs. Downs. Terminated. Pack your things and find some other castle to bully. The housekeeper sputtered, her face turning dark red, but a glance at the ladies in the room and at Brian, pale and sweating on the sofa, kept her from protest. She left the room looking more shaken by losing her job than she had been by the fact that Brian must die. Alice turned and in a posture as queenly and commanding as any of the ladies might have wanted her to use. Send for Miss Pocket at once. End of chapter 29. Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret Elin Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin. Read by Dan McLaughlin. The end.